Hello YouTube. So I wanted to do kind of just an off-the-cuff video because I found myself watching a video by Father Barron. Word on Fire, I believe, is his YouTube channel. He's a Catholic priest, and he has some interesting. He's an interesting guy to listen to with respect to the question of theology from time to time. But I always find myself in this weird position with Father Barron because he is a very conservative thinker in a lot of ways. He's a very traditional thinker in a lot of ways, and I would say he's very pre-modern in a lot of ways. He'll talk about like great making properties and things like that. Very, very pre-modern notions, very Aristotelian, pre-critical metaphysics, right? Now, I'm not saying that actually as a criticism. It's interesting that he sort of takes that line. Now, what's interesting about Father Barron to me, however, so hold on. Let me just say that there's a wide spectrum of people who do theology in the Catholic Church. Again, he might object to it, but I think I'd place him maybe center right wing on that theological spectrum. So you don't get any crazy stuff. You don't get Jean-Luc Barron conceiving of God as the one who does not exist, right? You don't get any of that kind of the stuff that you don't really get a lot of the stuff that I'm interested in actually. But Father Barron does make some interesting moves with apologetics because I think we in the YouTube world are very much used to Protestants and their forms of apologetics, and it's interesting to see a Catholic who has you have all of 2,000 years of church tradition to sort of draw on, and Father Barron is very clearly well educated in that tradition. We probably like him. We would probably pick different things out of that tradition. But my interests in theology have always lain with the radicals. But I always find watching his videos to be a really interesting experience because he starts out saying I always think at least, he starts out saying really interesting things that make me think, wow, I never thought about it like that. And then he draws conclusions that I just can't follow, right? Or that I think there's a little bit of sleight of hand going on. And the video that I just watched, and I'll post a link to it, is he calls it the argument from desire, right? And he tries to claim that there's a certain set of desires which prove the existence of the thing that is desired, right? And then he claims that we all have a desire for something unconditioned, and that thing we call God, right? Now, I don't really actually want to get into the details of the argument because I'm not going to try and rebut it in that way. Rather, I want to point out where I think he makes an interesting move and then where it falls apart. First of all, I'm not actually convinced. He seems to be convinced. I'm not actually convinced that everybody has this restless longing for God, right? The God-shaped hole, right? I'm not actually convinced, but I can understand, right? Like I think I can understand that. I think I can understand this desire, this longing, right? Now, that in itself is extremely interesting. I think that human beings actually, in a very generalized way, I think human beings do have a sort of metaphysical longing. We have a longing for transcendence, right? Something that exceeds the finitude of the situation that we find ourselves in. And in fact, exceeds every possible situation that we could find ourselves in. And in my view, sort of dwelling in that is what the Christian tradition names faith. I'm going to post this on his thing, and he's surely not going to respond. But if he does, I would ask him if he would consider that a fair characterization of what faith is. Sort of dwelling in. Kierkegaard frames it as the expectation of victory, right? But I think another way to say that would be to dwell in a longing or an expectation that exceeds the concrete, determinate, finite, contingent situations that we're in. And I think we do have that kind of desire. And I think the very fact that we have a history of metaphysics as a species speaks to that. There is something sort of human about that. Now, so that in itself, and Father Barron has brought up before the famous first lines. It's not actually the first lines; it's like the third or fourth sentence in Augustine's Confessions, right? Our hearts are restless until they rest in Thee, right? So this is a statement of a kind of argument from desire, right? We can't find peace until we turn our eyes to something transcendent. Maybe true, maybe not. I don't know. But again, I think it's interesting insofar as we consider that as an existential condition, right? And I think that, well, so I think it's interesting if we consider it to be an existential condition, and I think we can talk about it. I think we can have interesting and meaningful conversations about the human longing for transcendence and how that produces art and philosophy and music and all this beautiful like corpus of what it is to be a human, corpus of discourse. What I don't understand though is how or what I don't feel like very much is actually gained by taking that extra step and saying that something is demonstrated in virtue of this desire. I'm actually suspicious of the moves that he makes. I think that there's some sleight of hand going on. If I sat down and really thought about the steps that he takes, I'm sure it falls apart. It doesn't. It smacks of that kind of argument to me. But so you get this interesting idea that there is this existential condition, and then he takes an extra step and he wants to take the existential and make it metaphysical. That is to ground the existence of something in that. And I don't think that is. First, I don't think it works, and second of all, I don't think it's actually interesting. And I think it's paradoxical as well. I think that the longing for God, if there is such a thing in human beings in general, I think that the longing for God speaks to the absence of God. I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean his non-existence, but it speaks to what's often called divine hiddenness, right? That is, if there is a God, where is he, right? So it speaks to the reality of divine hiddenness. And I say that this is a reality. I think whether or not God exists, we have this concept, and it's nowhere to be found. And that's all I mean by divine hiddenness. And I think if this longing exists, and if the reality of divine hiddenness confronts us, then there's a tension that I think that you can build a theology out of outward, right? And I think that you can start to do really interesting and rich and beautiful things with this. And just to give another example, and I'll do this quickly, he gives an argument, the Leibnizian argument from contingency, right? Everything has an explanation for its existence outside of it, right? And so you end up with an infinite regress, and therefore you need to terminate that regress in a being that contains its own explanation for its own existence. So you need a necessary being, and we call that thing God, right? Now, that's a really, really, really succinct and probably butchered version of Leibniz's argument. But Father Barron actually does something really interesting with it in other videos, and I can't link to them because they're I've seen him mention it a few times. But he talks about this in terms of the experience of contingency, right? I go about my life. I mean, if we were to put this in Buddhist terms, it would be the experience of transience, right? The experience that all things disappear and all things pass away, right? And everything is unstable, and everything seems to be, in terms of the intelligibility of the world, if we look at each individual thing, everything seems to be passing off its reason. It's passing the buck, right? And so you can experience. I think it's a real experience. I think I've had this experience, right? The experience of everything seeming absurd, to use an existentialist word, right? And I mean it in their sense, right? Everything seems absurd, and through that experience of the absurdity of things and the transience of the world, the contingency of the world, I think that a kind of theology can emerge, right? I can understand how that experience can lead somebody into the affirmation of the existence of a God. Now, the issue that I have here, though, right, is that, and I have this issue with all of apologetics, I think, is that contemporary apologetics seems really concerned with establishing the existence of God, right? I mean, that would seem tautological to us now. That's just what apologetics does. It tries to establish the existence of a God, right? But I don't think that's historically what it does, right? I don't think that that's historically its place. I think if you look at someone like Anselm, if you look at someone like Thomas Aquinas, if you look at their writing, it seems to be more like we believe in God from the get-go, right? We are believers, right? That question is settled. And then instead of asking the epistemic question, how do we demonstrate this thing? How can we have a knowledge of the existence of God? How can we establish this thing? That's not the kind of question that I think Anselm and Aquinas are asking. I think they're asking something more like a hermeneutic question, right? We have this concept of God. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean to say God exists, right? Can we think of a way that we can sort of think through this being? And something that I've harped on a lot on my channel throughout the years is that not everybody says yes to that question. Not everybody thinks that we can think through the existence of this being. The ineffability of God becomes very central for a lot of people. But I think that when you look at someone like Anselm, what he's saying is, well, I already believe in God. But what kind of belief is that? What kind of thing is God? What is this thing that I believe in? And he tries to clarify that by describing it as a being, as first of all the greatest being, right? And a being that, if the being that you're thinking of could not exist, then you're not thinking of God, right? That's what I think Anselm is saying. I think that he's like the ontological argument, I think, is there. I think he's positing it as a kind of corrective, right? As a way of saying, well, I have this idea of God, bearded man sitting on a cloud. Um, well, I could conceive of that thing not existing, so therefore it must be an idol, right? Okay, well maybe what if it's like an abstract sort of first principle or something? Well, I could conceive of that not existing, so that must be an idol, right? And like that's what I think is going on in the ontological argument. Um, Aquinas seems to not be. He seems to be a little bit more lukewarm on that, but if you look at that language that he always uses, and we call this thing God, right? There's a first mover, right? There is movement, therefore there must have been a first movement, and a first mover, and we call that thing God. Again, what I think he's thinking is, I have this concept of God. Now, how do I clarify that? Well, this is one way to conceive of it. The thing that initiated the movement in the universe. And that seems a little bit more like graspable. That seems a little bit more like clear than some nebulous apophatic god or a god, even talking in terms of three persons in one, or like all the really high theological language leaves you very confused if you try to think through it. And I think that these people, the classic apologists, were trying to come up with ways to kind of get at this thing. Rather than trying to establish its existence. I think that for Aquinas and Anselm, their existence is taken for granted. And so then, of course, it becomes, under that light at least, whether or not you accept or reject that reading, if we accept it for the time being, then under that light, it all of a sudden these arguments take on a very existential character. They become tools that we can use to clarify the concept of God. What kind of thing is God? Well, the universe looks designed. God was the designer. So therefore, like, God is the thing that imbues things with purpose and intention and like even utility, direction, right? God is that kind of thing, right? Or the argument from beauty, right? Where does beauty come from? Oh, it must be God, right? Well, what kind of being is God? Well, he's the source of all beauty, right? That's a way to think about God. Now, all of that seems to me to be bound up with existential practices like prayer, right? It seems like, again, these are ways that a prayerful person, right, can think through or work through just what they're doing in their spiritual life, right? And that's kind of the utility. So this is I think the real meat of it, right? When you talk about the argument from desire, well, what kind of being is God? God is the kind of being that is the end of potentially all desire, right? Certainly some theologians would claim that, right? All desire in the end goes to God, or ought go to God. If it doesn't, then there's something misaligned. So that then again becomes a way to think through God, and it becomes a way to sort of existentially orient ourselves towards God. And again, that seems to be the meat, right? And it strikes me as just being kind of tacked on to say, well, and therefore the thing exists, right? That seems to be like an anachronistic use of these kinds of arguments. Maybe not for C.S. Lewis, who Father Barron mentions. but particularly if you're talking about someone like Saint Anselm or Saint Augustine, right? Like I feel like it's actually anachronistic um, to conceive of things in that way. Um, uh, so apologetics then becomes something I think much more interesting. Actually, apologetics becomes, it's not a debate where people sell books and post YouTube videos and R and Ra and Matt Slick scream at each other, right? Like, it's not what apologetics is anymore. That whole view of apologetics just kind of melts. And what apologetics becomes is the theological struggle for the believer against idolatry. And it becomes a way to deepen the intimacy with God during prayer. Right? So apologetics becomes a technology of the self. It becomes a way of um, of, of again orienting oneself towards the world. It's practical religion, essentially. It's the practice of religion, in a way, and possibly even the highest practice of religion in a certain sense. And I feel like, I don't know. Leave me a comment and let me know, but I feel like that gets really cheapened when it becomes a question of, I don't know, do I have a coffee cup next to me? I can make an argument for that, right? Oh, well, if I do this, you hear that sound. Maybe you heard it, maybe you didn't. You hear a sound. Oh, well, that might indicate that this coffee cup exists. I don't know. It turns God into a very banal object, I think, rather than an object of intimacy. Um, it becomes like talking about, I don't know, any stupid object in the world when you treat things in this way. And so what I think is interesting about Father Barron here, and I'll end with this, what I think is interesting about Father Barron here is I wonder the degree to which he realizes this. And this is, I guess, my question that I've advanced to him. Do you really think, like, do you tack that last part on because you feel that there's some constituency of atheists who demand that, or there's some constituency of faithful people who are perhaps losing their faith and are starting to demand ways of demonstrating the existence of this thing in this way? Because it seems like Father Barron does both, right? It seems like he uses the arguments, or he explains them in such a way that makes me think that he understands sort of the existential depth associated with these kinds of ponderings. Um, uh, and then he wraps it up in like a weird William Lane Craig bow. It's like walking from Kierkegaard or Gabriel Marcel to William Lane Craig in the course of a I don't want to say a lecture, in the course of a soliloquy, I guess you could, in the course of a YouTube video. You get these weird poles of apologetics. I don't know. So have a good night, YouTube.